My name is Scarlett, and at 32 years old, I am the sole proprietor of the company that cast me out a decade ago. It's a strange turn of events, one that started with grief and betrayal and ended in the sharp, sweet taste of justice. When my stepmother and stepsister came to me, their empire crumbling, they thought my price for the apples that could save them would be a number on a check. They never imagined the price would be a name, theirs. They never imagined my price was the company itself. This is the story of how a neglected plot of land, a forgotten secret, and a decade of silence allowed me to reclaim the legacy they stole from me. Before I dive into the whole story of how I turned their greed into my greatest victory, I want to welcome you. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And if you've ever felt underestimated or counted out by the very people who should have been your biggest supporters, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more than you know. For all the new viewers, make sure you subscribe to join our community of people who know that the best comebacks are the ones no one sees coming. My story, the real story, begins not with victory, but with the suffocating scent of lilies and the hushed, respectful quiet of a funeral home. My father, John, was gone. He had been the sun in my sky, a man whose hands were perpetually stained with earth and whose laughter echoed through the apple trees of our family's orchard. Blackwood Orchards wasn't just a business to him. It was a living, breathing entity, a sprawling green kingdom he had nurtured from his father's humble beginnings into a regional powerhouse. I had grown up in his shadow, not as a subordinate, but as an apprentice. From the time I could walk, I was toddling behind him, learning the language of the trees, how to read their leaves, how to listen to the hum of the bees, how to know by scent alone when an apple was ready to be picked. He taught me everything. Or so I thought. His death was sudden, a heart attack that stole him away in the middle of a crisp autumn night, leaving a silence in the world that felt louder than any storm. The week that followed was a blur of casseroles from neighbors and condolences from business associates. Through it all, I moved in a daze, comforted only by the familiar weight of the orchard around me. My stepmother, Eleanor, and my stepsister, Beatrice, handled the arrangements. Eleanor had married my father when I was 12, a woman as polished and hard as the granite countertops she'd insisted on installing in our rustic farmhouse. Beatrice, her daughter, was 2 years older than me, and had always looked at me with a kind of detached pity, as if my love for the dirt and the trees was a charming but ultimately pathetic character flaw. The day of the will reading was a week after the funeral. It was a cold, gray afternoon that promised rain. We gathered in the sterile, mahogany-paneled office of my father's lawyer, Mr. Henderson, a man I'd known my whole life. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes refusing to meet mine. Eleanor sat perfectly composed in a tailored black suit, a stark contrast to my simple dress. Beatrice sat beside her, a miniature, less confident version of her mother. I remember the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, each tick a hammer blow against my already fractured heart. I expected the will to be straightforward. My father had always said, "This will all be yours one day, Scar. Yours and mine to run together." We were partners in spirit, if not yet on paper. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat and began to read. The legal language was dense and confusing, a river of jargon that swept past me until it hit a waterfall. He spoke of my father's updated business arrangements, documents signed only 6 months prior. He explained that full operational control and 90% of the shares in Blackwood Orchards were to be transferred to a trust, managed by Eleanor. The remaining 10% was Beatrice's. My name was not mentioned. The clock ticked. The air in the room grew thick and heavy. I felt the blood drain from my face. I couldn't breathe. What? The word was a faint whisper, a ghost of a sound. Eleanor placed a perfectly manicured hand on my arm. Her touch was cold. "Scarlett, dear," she began, her voice dripping with a practiced, synthetic sympathy. "Your father and I had many long talks about this. He loved your passion. He truly did. But passion doesn't run a business of this scale." She squeezed my arm, a gesture meant to seem comforting but felt like a vice. He worried. "You lack a certain pragmatism. A business sense. The company is facing new challenges, global markets, logistical complexities. It needs a firm, experienced hand." He knew I could provide that. I looked from her face to Beatrice's. We just stared at her lap, her silence a form of loud, ringing agreement. I turned to Mr. Henderson, my eyes pleading. Mr. Henderson? My father, he wouldn't. He promised me. The lawyer finally looked at me, his expression a mixture of professional duty and personal regret. The documents are in order, Scarlett. Your father signed them. His mind was sound. He then read the final, insulting clause. To my daughter Scarlett, he read, his voice faltering slightly, I leave my small 1-acre experimental plot on the North Ridge, along with the shed and all its contents. May she find the same joy in the folly that I did. The folly. That's what he had called it. It was a patch of land he'd bought years ago, a place he went to tinker with odd rootstocks and forgotten apple varieties. It was his hobby, his escape. To everyone else, it was a joke. Eleanor had often referred to it as John's little dirt patch. And now it was all I had left of him. A plot of land named for foolishness. It was the ultimate dismissal, a posthumous declaration that I was not a successor, but a hobbyist, just like he supposedly was in his private moments. The thriving 100-acre business that was my birthright, the legacy I was supposed to carry, had been handed to the woman who saw apples as units of currency and the land as a line item on a balance sheet. I was pushed out, not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating scratch of a pen. I walked out of that office into the rain without another word, the insult clinging to me like the damp chill in the air. They hadn't just taken my inheritance. They had taken my future, and worse, they had twisted my father's memory into a weapon to do it. The first few months were a study in despair. I moved out of the farmhouse I had called home my entire life and into the dilapidated shed on the Folly. It was more of a shack, really. A single room with a leaky roof, a pot-bellied stove for heat, and no running water. My world had shrunk from 100 acres of manicured, productive trees to this 1 acre of tangled, overgrown wilderness. The plot was a mess. Weeds choked the ground, and the few dozen trees my father had planted were scraggly and untended, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. For weeks, I did almost nothing. I slept on a cot, ate canned soup heated on the stove, and stared out the grimy window at the chaos of the land, my grief a heavy shroud. Eleanor's words echoed in my mind. You lack a business sense. The thought was a poison, seeping into the cracks of my sorrow. Maybe she was right. Maybe my father had seen it too in the end. Maybe I was just a girl who liked playing in the dirt, a sentimental fool unfit for the real world. The loneliness was a physical presence, a constant ache in my chest. To survive, I had to swallow my pride and get a job. The only place hiring in our small town was the Greasy Spoon, a diner off the highway. I spent my days taking orders, refilling coffee cups, and cleaning up spills, my hands smelling of bleach and fried onions instead of earth and apple blossoms. The pay was barely enough to keep me in firewood and canned goods. My regulars were truckers and a few locals who looked at me with a mixture of pity and curiosity. I was John Blackwood's daughter, the girl who should have been a queen, now serving bacon and eggs. Every clink of a coffee cup was a reminder of my fall from grace. At night, I would return to the cold shack, exhausted and hollowed out, the shame of it all a bitter taste in my mouth. One particularly bleak evening, huddled by the stove, I almost gave up. I was ready to pack my few belongings and leave, to run away from the ghost of my father and the triumph of my stepmother. But as I was kicking at a loose floorboard in my frustration, my boot caught on something. It was a small, recessed metal ring. I pulled at it, and a section of the floor lifted up, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, nestled in oilcloth, was a large, leather-bound chest. My father's gardening chest. I hadn't seen it since he passed. My heart hammered against my ribs as I lifted the heavy lid. It was filled with his things. Old seed catalogs, rusted pruning shears, a faded photograph of my mother, who had died when I was young. And underneath it all, a thick, worn journal. I opened it carefully. The first page was dated 15 years prior. The Folly Year 1, it read. I spent the rest of the night, and many nights after, devouring that journal by the light of a kerosene lamp. It was my father's secret heart, laid bare on the page. He wrote about his growing disillusionment with the commercial side of the orchard business. Eleanor is right, in a way. One entry read, We have to think about margins, efficiency, yield per acre. But in the process, we are losing the soul of it. The apples are becoming uniform, predictable. We are growing for the supermarket shelf, not for the palate. He wrote of his fear that a single, catastrophic event, like a late frost or a new blight, could wipe out the entire industry because everyone was growing the same few, vulnerable varieties. And then I found the core of it. His foolish experiment wasn't foolish at all. It was a desperate act of preservation and innovation. He had been collecting rare, nearly extinct apple scions from all over the world and painstakingly crossbreeding them with hardy, local crabapples. His goal was to create something new, an apple that was not only complex and delicious, but could also withstand the increasingly unpredictable weather patterns. He was building an ark. The journal was filled with detailed notes on grafting techniques, soil composition, and pollination schedules. It was a masterclass in horticulture, a textbook written by the only professor I had ever wanted. He had given it a name, a hopeful, poetic name that stood in stark contrast to the plot's mocking title. He called his creation Malus Solaris Hemes, the winter sun apple. Suddenly, the scraggly trees outside weren't just a sad reminder of what I'd lost. They were a map. They were a mission. My father hadn't abandoned me. He had left me his true legacy, his most important work, hidden away from the world that wouldn't understand. He had left me a puzzle to solve. That night, the despair began to recede, replaced by a tiny, fragile spark of purpose. This wasn't the folly. This was the Arkansas, and I was its keeper. The next day, I woke up a different person. I walked out of the shack not with dread, but with determination. I had my father's journal in one hand and his old pruning shears in the other. The work was monumental. I spent my mornings before my diner shift and my evenings after, clearing the weeds, testing the soil, and carefully tending to each individual tree, following my father's notes to the letter. It was back-breaking labor. My muscles screamed in protest, and my hands became a permanent tapestry of calluses, cuts, and dirt. It was during this time that I met Arthur. He was my only neighbor, an old man who lived in a small, neat house on the other side of the ridge. He'd known my father for 40 years. He'd watched me from his porch for weeks before he finally ambled over one afternoon, a thermos of coffee in his hand. He was tall and lean, with a face like a wrinkled apple and kind, knowing eyes. He didn't offer pity. He offered advice. "Your father was always up to something over here," he said, his voice a low rumble. Folks thought he was losing his marbles. I knew better. He saw things others didn't. In the soil, in the seeds. He looked at me, a long, appraising look. "Maybe in you too." Arthur became my lifeline. He taught me how to properly sharpen the shears, how to read the weather by the clouds, how to have patience. He would bring me hot soup on cold days and sit with me in the evenings, telling me stories about my father, filling in the gaps of my memory. He was the grandfather I'd never had, a quiet, steady presence in my solitary world. He never once questioned my mission. He simply believed. The years crawled by. 5 of them. Each one was a cycle of hope and hardship. There were small victories, a successful graft, a tree that finally blossomed. And there were crushing setbacks, a bout of fire blight that almost wiped out a whole row, a harsh winter that killed 3 of the most promising saplings. All the while, I kept working at the diner, the smell of grease a constant reminder of the life I was fighting to leave behind. I was a ghost in my own town, a footnote in the story of Blackwood Orchards, which, under Eleanor's leadership, was apparently thriving. I'd hear snippets of news from customers, new distribution deals, glossy magazine features. It was a world away, a life that was no longer mine. I felt no envy, only a grim resolve to prove them wrong on my own terms. Then, in the autumn of the 5th year, it happened. One of the trees, a cross between a golden russet and a hardy Siberian crabapple, produced its first real crop. There were only about 2 dozen apples, and they looked strange. They were small, with a rough, reddish-gold skin that seemed to glow in the sunlight. I picked one, my hand trembling slightly. It felt heavy solid. I polished it on my sleeve and took a bite. The world stopped. It was an explosion of flavor unlike anything I had ever tasted. It was intensely crisp, the sound echoing in the quiet orchard. The first wave of taste was a sharp, bright tartness that quickly mellowed into a deep, complex sweetness, with notes of honey, pear, and a faint, lingering spice that warmed my throat. It was the taste of autumn sunshine, of cold, clean air, of the rich earth itself. It was perfect. I sank to my knees, the half-eaten apple in my hand, and I wept. I cried for my father, for the genius he had hidden away. I cried for the years of backbreaking work, for the loneliness and the doubt, and I cried with a surge of pure, unadulterated triumph. This was it. This was the winter sun. And it was real. Eleanor could have her sprawling empire of bland, uniform red delicious apples. I had this. I had a miracle. That single bite of fruit was not just an apple. It was a promise. It was the moment I knew, with absolute certainty, that I wasn't a fool. I was an heiress to a different kind of kingdom, a richer one, and my reign was just beginning. Holding the winter sun apple in my hand was like holding a key. The problem was I didn't know which door it unlocked. The harvest from that one tree, and the few others that began to bear fruit over the next 2 years, was far too small to sell commercially. Taking a few bushels to the market would be a drop in the ocean, and the unique quality of the apple would be lost. I felt a familiar wave of uncertainty. What now? The answer, once again, came from my father's journal. Tucked into a back pocket was a small, folded pamphlet on artisanal cider making. He had made notes in the margins, circling phrases like terroir-driven and single varietal expression. He hadn't just been creating a new apple. He had envisioned its ultimate form. The idea took root in my mind. Cider. Not the sugary, mass-produced stuff that filled supermarket shelves, but real cider, a complex, fermented beverage that could showcase the incredible profile of the winter sun apple. It felt right. It felt like the final chapter of my father's secret story. I threw myself into this new challenge with the same obsessive focus I had given the trees. My tiny shack became a makeshift laboratory. I used the last of my meager savings from the diner to buy a small fruit press, a few glass carboys, and some specialized yeast strains. The learning curve was brutally steep. My first batch was undrinkable, a sour, cloudy mess. My second batch exploded, leaving a sticky film over everything in the shack. I was constantly running back and forth between my diner shifts and my bubbling, temperamental experiments, often working late into the night, powered by coffee and sheer force of will. Arthur would occasionally peer in, shake his head with a smile, and say, "Your dad was the same way." Once he got an idea in his head, the rest of the world just disappeared. It took almost 2 years of trial and error, of meticulously tweaking recipes and fermentation times, before I created something I was proud of. The final product was beautiful. It was a pale gold in the glass, with a fine, persistent effervescence. The aroma was a complex bouquet of baked apple, wildflowers, and a hint of wet stone. And the taste was everything. It had the bright acidity and deep, honeyed sweetness of the apple, but with an added layer of yeasty complexity and a crisp, dry finish. It was elegant, powerful, and utterly unique. I decided to call it Folly's Harvest. The name was a private joke, a defiant nod to the insult that had become my inspiration. It was my way of turning their mockery into my brand. Around this time, in the 7th year of my exile, Beatrice showed up unannounced. I was out by the press, covered in apple pulp and sweat, when her pristine luxury sedan crawled up my muddy track. She stepped out wearing a cream-colored cashmere coat and shoes that were clearly not meant for dirt. She looked around at my small, rustic operation with an expression of profound, theatrical pity. "Scarlett," she said, her voice oozing a condescending concern that set my teeth on edge. "Mother and I were just talking. We feel so terribly for you, still out here, playing in the dirt." She gestured vaguely at my press. "It's a cute little hobby, I suppose. But it can't possibly be a life." I stood there, my hands stained, my clothes reeking of fermenting apples, and I felt a cold, hard anger solidify in my gut. I didn't say anything, just wiped my hands on a rag and looked at her. "We were thinking," she continued, oblivious to the fury building behind my calm facade, "that it's time you came in from the cold. We could offer you a job. A real job." packing boxes at the main facility. The pay is decent, and you'd have benefits. It's time to let go of this fantasy. Her words were meant to be a lifeline, an act of charity from a benevolent queen to a peasant. But what I heard was the same old dismissal, the same deeply ingrained belief that I was, and always would be, less than them. I finally found my voice. It was quiet, steady, and devoid of the emotion she expected. "Thank you for the offer, B. But I'm fine." I looked her directly in the eye. "I like my hobby." My composure seemed to unsettle her more than any outburst would have. She had come expecting gratitude or perhaps a tearful breakdown. She didn't know what to do with my quiet dignity. She mumbled something about me being stubborn, just like my father, and retreated to her clean, comfortable car, leaving a puff of exhaust in her wake. That encounter was a turning point. The anger it stoked in me burned away the last vestiges of my self-doubt. It was no longer just about honoring my father's legacy. It was about building my own. I started selling Folly's Harvest at the local farmer's market. I only had a few cases each week, but they sold out within the first hour, every single time. People were fascinated by the story and captivated by the taste. Word began to spread. A well-known food blogger from the city stumbled upon my stall one weekend. He bought a bottle, and a week later, an article appeared online titled, "The best cider in America is being made in a shed." My life changed overnight. My inbox was flooded with inquiries from specialty bottle shops, high-end restaurants, and distributors. I was overwhelmed, but it was a good kind of overwhelmed. I quit my job at the diner. The day I walked in and handed in my apron was one of the sweetest moments of my life. With Arthur's help and a small business loan I secured using my new, documented success, I built a proper, albeit small, cidery next to the shack. It was still modest, but it was clean, efficient, and entirely mine. I remained small by choice, focusing on quality over quantity. Folly's Harvest became a cult phenomenon, a boutique product that connoisseurs sought out, willing to pay a premium for its rarity and excellence. They never connected the name Folly's Harvest to Blackwood orchards. In their world of mass production, my tiny operation was a charming anomaly, a curiosity. I was invisible to them, and that was my greatest advantage. On a whim, and with a great deal of encouragement from Arthur, I sent a few bottles of my cider to the most prestigious international beverage competition in the world. I packed them up, sent them off, and promptly forgot about it, too busy with the harvest to entertain any wild fantasies. Months passed. Then, one rainy Tuesday morning, an email landed in my inbox. The subject line read, "Results, International Cider and Perry Competition." I opened it with a trembling hand. I scrolled past the introductory text, my eyes scanning for my name, and there it was. Folly's Harvest Gold Medal, Best in Show. I stared at the screen, reading the words over and over again. Gold Medal, Best in Show. Not just in the country, but in the world. My little shed project, my hobby, had been judged the best. The air left my lungs in a whoosh. I stumbled out of the cidery into the rain. My face turned up to the sky, and I just laughed. It was a wild, unhinged sound of pure, unadulterated joy. I had done it. I had taken the insult they had thrown at me and turned it into a gold medal. I had taken their pity and transformed it into international acclaim. I was no longer John Blackwood's forgotten daughter. I was Scarlett, the creator of the best cider in the world. And they had absolutely no idea. The award changed everything, and yet, on the surface, very little. The news made a ripple, but mostly in niche, gourmet circles. A few articles were written, my name and the name Folly's Harvest celebrated among those who cared about such things. But in the grand corporate world of Blackwood orchards, I remained a ghost. To Eleanor and Beatrice, I was still just the poor relation playing in the mud on a worthless patch of land. They were too consumed with their own empire building to notice the tiny kingdom rising on their border. I heard whispers that their aggressive expansion had come at a cost. Quality was slipping. Longtime employees, men my father had trusted for decades, were let go and replaced with cheaper, less experienced labor. They were producing more apples than ever, but the soul, as my father had feared, was gone. They were a machine, and I was a garden. For 3 more years, I continued my work. My life found a quiet, satisfying rhythm. I expanded my orchard, carefully grafting winter sun scions onto new rootstock. My production grew, but I kept it limited, preserving the boutique status and exceptional quality of my cider. The demand was far greater than my supply, which only fueled its mystique. I was financially secure, professionally respected, and personally fulfilled. I had built a life for myself out of the ashes of my old one, and I had done it entirely on my own terms. The anger and hurt of the past had cooled into a kind of serene, confident calm. I no longer needed their validation. I had my own. Then came the frost. It was an event that would be spoken of in the valley for generations. A freak weather pattern brought a brutal, unseasonable cold snap in late April, long after the trees had blossomed. For 2 nights, the temperature plummeted far below freezing. It was a catastrophe for every orchardist in the region. I woke on the first morning of the frost to a world encased in glittering ice. A thick, crystalline shell coated every branch, every leaf, every blade of grass. It was eerily beautiful, but my heart pounded with a terrible dread. I threw on my boots and coat and ran out to my small orchard, my breath pluming in the frigid air. I stopped at the edge of the first row of trees, my eyes scanning the branches. And then I saw it. Beneath the delicate filigree of ice, the tiny, nascent apples were unharmed. They were firm, green, and perfect. The blossoms that hadn't yet fruited were still vibrant, their petals protected by the very frost that should have killed them. My father's dream, his life's work, was a resounding success. The winter sun apple was truly frost-resistant. A wave of profound, solemn gratitude washed over me. "You did it, Dad," I whispered into the frozen air. I spent the day in a strange state of awe, walking among my perfect, resilient trees while the news on the radio painted a grim picture of devastation across the valley. Blackwood Orchards, with its hundreds of acres of vulnerable, commercial varieties, was hit hardest. The report said they were facing a total crop loss. 100%. 3 days later, I saw the car. A sleek, black sedan, so out of place on my rugged track that it looked like a spaceship had landed. It crunched to a halt near my cidery, and 2 figures emerged, Eleanor and Beatrice. They looked diminished. The usual air of imperious confidence was gone, replaced by a gray, haggard exhaustion. Their expensive clothes looked rumpled, their faces strained with sleeplessness and stress. They walked towards me, their eyes sweeping over my small orchard, taking in the impossible sight of trees laden with healthy, abundant fruit. I could see the disbelief warring with a desperate, dawning hope on their faces. I stood by the door of my cidery, my arms crossed, and waited. I didn't greet them. I just waited. Eleanor was the first to speak, her voice raspy. "Scarlett." It was not a greeting, but an acknowledgement of a shocking reality. We heard a rumor that someone on the North Ridge had been spared. Her gaze was fixed on the apples behind me. "We didn't realize it was you." Beatrice was silent, her eyes darting everywhere but at me. She looked profoundly humiliated, like a monarch forced to beg in a foreign court. "The frost was bad," I said, my voice even. It was a statement, not a question. Eleanor's composure finally cracked. "Bad? It was a wipeout. We've lost everything." Everything. The carefully constructed facade of the unflappable businesswoman crumbled, revealing the panicked woman beneath. We have major contracts with national chains. If we can't deliver, we're finished. The penalties alone will bankrupt us." She took a step closer, her eyes now pleading. The polished mask was back in place, but it was ill-fitting. This was a performance. "Scarlett, we need to buy your fruit. All of it. We know it's not a lot, but it might be enough to satisfy the most critical orders to buy us some time." She attempted a smile, a grotesque twisting of her lips. "We'll pay you, of course. Handsomely. Double the market rate. Triple. Just name your price." There it was. The moment. 10 years of silence, of toil, of being underestimated and dismissed, had all led to this. Name your price. They saw me as a simple farmer, a little person with a lucky crop who could be bought off with a fat check. They thought the solution to their problem was money. They still didn't understand. I had learned over the past decade that some things were beyond currency. Legacy, justice, respect. I let the silence stretch, watching the desperation grow in their eyes. I had spent years fantasizing about this moment, imagining a fiery confrontation, a litany of my grievances. But the woman I was now was not that angry girl from 10 years ago. I was calm. I was in control. I finally uncrossed my arms. "The price isn't something you can write on a check, Eleanor," I said softly. My quiet tone seemed to frighten them more than shouting would have. "Why don't you come inside?" I turned and walked into my cabin, the small, clean space that had been my sanctuary. I left the door open for them to follow. They exchanged a confused, wary look and then entered, ducking their heads as they came through the door. The cabin was warm from the lingering heat of the wood stove. On the simple pine table in the center of the room sat a single, solitary manila file. It had been prepared by a lawyer I had hired the year before, a shrewd but kind woman who had helped me navigate the complexities of my growing business. I had asked her to draw up this document as a contingency, a shield, never truly believing I would need to use it. I gestured for them to sit at the table. They sat awkwardly, their expensive suits looking absurd in the rustic simplicity of my home. I sat opposite them, took a deep breath, and slid the file across the table. Eleanor picked it up with hesitant fingers. Beatrice leaned in to look. Eleanor opened it, her eyes scanning the first page. I watched as the color drained from her face. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to pure, unadulterated shock. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. "You asked me to name my price," I said, my voice as steady as the old wood of the table. "There it is. My price for the winter sun apples, the entire harvest, enough to save Blackwood orchards from ruin, is a controlling stake in the company. 51%. I leaned forward, my gaze locking with Eleanor's. "You will sell your shares and Beatrice will sell hers to me. For the grand total of $1. I paused, letting the weight of my words fill the small room. "And in exchange," I finished, "I will use my fruit to save our family's business." The only sound was the crackle of the fire in the stove and the frantic, shallow breathing of the two women who had stolen my life and were now being asked to hand it back. For a long moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The silence in the cabin was absolute, broken only by the faint, frantic pounding of my own heart. Eleanor's face was a mask of incandescent rage. The shock had burned away, leaving behind a raw, sputtering fury. "You can't be serious," she finally hissed, her voice trembling with indignation. She slammed the file down on the table. "This is monstrous. It's extortion." "Is it?" I asked, my voice remaining level, a calm island in her storm. "I seem to recall you telling me that passion doesn't run a business. That it requires a certain pragmatism. This is the most pragmatic solution I can imagine. The business is on the verge of collapse due to a foreseeable agricultural risk, a risk my father was actively working to mitigate. You, with your business sense, ignored his work and left the company completely vulnerable. I, with my hobby, hold the only viable asset that can prevent its total failure. Transferring control to the party with the more sustainable model seems like a sound business decision to me." I was using her own language against her, and every word was a perfectly aimed dart. "Your father would be ashamed of you," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "To use his memory, his work, to be so cruel, so vengeful." That was the line. The one thing that could still pierce my armor of calm. A hot wave of anger, the old anger I thought I had buried, surged through me. "My father." I leaned across the table, my eyes boring into hers. "My father would be ashamed of you. He would be ashamed that you took his life's work and hollowed it out, turning his orchard into a factory for mediocre fruit. He would be heartbroken that you dismissed his greatest passion, this very land, these very trees, as a folly. You talk about his memory? You too are the ones who desecrated it. You turned him into a caricature of a bumbling dreamer to justify your own greed. I am not being vengeful, Eleanor. I am restoring his true legacy. I am here to save this company from the very people who claim to be its saviors but have been its poison." Eleanor recoiled as if struck. Beside her, Beatrice just seemed to crumple. The fight had completely gone out of her. She stared down at her hands, her shoulders slumped in defeat. She looked up at me, her eyes filled not with anger, but with a dawning, horrified understanding. For the first time, I think she was seeing the past 10 years not through her mother's lens, but for what they truly were. I stood up, the movement signaling the end of the discussion. "You have 24 hours to decide," I said, my voice once again cool and measured. "My lawyer has the paperwork ready to be signed. If I don't hear from your lawyer by noon tomorrow, the offer is withdrawn. I'll sell my harvest to the highest bidder, and believe me, after the frost, there are many. I will be fine. Blackwood Orchards will not." I walked to the door and held it open. "I think you know the way out." They left in a stunned silence, Eleanor radiating a helpless fury, Beatrice looking like a ghost. I watched their expensive car disappear down the track, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. The moment they were gone, my knees gave out. I sank onto the chair, my body trembling with the adrenaline of the confrontation. I had done it. I had stood my ground. But the victory felt heavy somber. Arthur must have heard the car, because a few minutes later he appeared at the door, a worried look on his face. He took one look at me and simply nodded. He came in, put the kettle on the stove, and sat with me in silence, a comforting presence that needed no words. The next morning was the longest of my life. Every tick of the clock was an agony of suspense. Had I overplayed my hand? Would their pride be greater than their desperation? I paced the floor of my cabin, my mind racing. At 11:30, my phone rang. It was my lawyer, Sarah. "They've accepted," she said, her voice calm and professional. "Their lawyer contacted me 10 minutes ago. They agreed to all terms. The signing is scheduled for 4 o'clock this afternoon at my office." A wave of relief so powerful it felt like a physical blow washed over me. It was done. The signing itself was a surreal, anticlimactic affair. We sat in Sarah's sterile conference room, the same kind of room where my life had been dismantled a decade earlier. But this time, I was the one at the head of the table. Eleanor and Beatrice were flanked by their lawyer, looking pale and defeated. Eleanor refused to look at me, her signature on the documents a vicious, angry slash of ink. Beatrice, however, was different. When it was her turn to sign, she paused. She looked up, and her eyes met mine across the table. In them, I saw a flicker of something I never expected: remorse. She signed her name with a slow, deliberate hand, then pushed the papers away as if they had burned her. The lawyers exchanged the documents. Sarah slid the final signed stack in front of me. It was over. I was now the majority shareholder and controlling director of Blackwood Orchards. As Eleanor stood to leave, I spoke one last time. "You once told me I lacked business sense," I said, my voice quiet but carrying across the room. "Perhaps you were right. I'm not a businesswoman." I held her gaze. "I'm an orchardist, just like my father. And I'm here to fix what you broke." She flinched, then turned and swept out of the room without another word, a fallen queen abdicating her throne. Beatrice hesitated for a moment, then followed her mother, leaving me alone in the silent room with the weight of my reclaimed legacy. The year that followed was one of profound and challenging transformation. Taking the helm of Blackwood Orchards was like trying to turn a massive, lumbering cargo ship with a canoe paddle. Eleanor's management style had been one of ruthless, short-sighted efficiency. The company was bloated with administrative overhead but starved of horticultural expertise. The soil was depleted, the trees were stressed, and the morale of the remaining long-term staff was at an all-time low. My first act as director was not to sit in the fancy corporate office, which I left empty, but to walk the land. I spent weeks walking every row of every orchard, my hands in the soil, listening to the trees. I started by undoing the damage. I rehired many of the skilled, experienced orchardists that Eleanor had fired, men and women who had worked alongside my father and understood the land. I brought in tons of organic compost, began a cover cropping program to restore the soil's health, and invested heavily in a new, sustainable irrigation system. My most ambitious project was the gradual transformation of the orchard itself. I established a large nursery and began the painstaking process of grafting thousands of winter sun scions onto the existing rootstock. It was a long-term investment, a plan that would take years to fully mature, but it was the only way to secure the company's future and honor my father's vision. I was rebuilding the Ark, but on a much grander scale. Eleanor was given a purely ceremonial title on the board and a small pension. It was more than she had given me, a fact that was not lost on her. She attended the first board meeting, her presence a thundercloud in the room, but her power was gone. She couldn't stand it. After that one meeting, she retired to a life of bitter obscurity, a ghost rattling the chains of her own making. Beatrice was the real surprise. About 2 months after the takeover, she appeared at the Folly, my Folly, which I still kept as my home and my personal cidery. She was dressed simply, in jeans and a plain sweater. She looked lost. "I wanted to see them," she said, her voice small, gesturing to the winter sun trees. I took her on a tour, explaining the crossbreeding, the patience it required, the way my father had documented everything. She listened with a quiet, genuine intensity. When we were done, she turned to me, her eyes glistening. "All those years," she whispered, "my mother told me your father was a dreamer, that his little projects were a waste of time and money that she had to compensate for with her business skills. She said you were just like him." I believed her. A tear traced a path down her cheek. She was wrong. About everything. He wasn't a dreamer. He was a visionary. And you're not just like him. You're the one who made his vision real. She took a shaky breath. "I know I have no right to ask. After everything. But how could you teach me? Not the business side. I don't care about that anymore. I want to learn about the trees. I want to learn what he knew. What you know." Her request hung in the air between us. The hurt part of me, the girl who had been cast out, wanted to say no. But the woman I had become, the woman who had learned forgiveness from the patience of the earth, saw a flicker of genuine repentance. I saw a chance to rebuild something, not as it was, but as something new. "The work starts at sunrise," I said simply. "Wear sturdy boots." It was the beginning of a fragile, uncertain truce. She started at the bottom, working alongside the crew, learning to prune, to graft, to harvest. She was clumsy at first, but she was dedicated. The walls between us didn't crumble overnight, but with every shared season, with every tree we tended together, a new foundation was laid, one built on shared work and quiet respect. Her change was slow, and I kept my boundaries firm, but for the first time, I felt like I might not have lost a sister, but gained one. Tonight, as I walk through the main orchard, the setting sun casting long shadows through the rows of healing trees, I feel a profound sense of peace. The air smells of rich earth and the promise of a future harvest. I didn't get my revenge. Revenge is a bitter, empty thing. What I got was something far more satisfying: restoration. I restored my father's name, his true work, and the soul of his company. I found my own worth not in taking back a corporation, but in nurturing the small, forgotten plot of land they had thrown away. The company was just the final, logical step in a journey that had started with a single, miraculous apple. They thought they had left me with nothing, but they had given me everything that mattered. As I look back on this incredible decade, the biggest lesson I've learned is that your value is not determined by the people who refuse to see it. It is something you cultivate yourself, in the quiet, difficult work that no one else is watching. Sometimes, being underestimated is the greatest advantage you can have. It gives you the space to grow, to build, to become so undeniably competent that your success becomes a force of nature they can no longer ignore. I'd love to hear from you all in the comments. Have you ever been in a situation where you were completely counted out, only to prove everyone wrong? Share your story below. Reading them reminds us all that we're not alone in these struggles. If my story resonated with you, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories about finding strength in unexpected places. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message, please share it with them. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey and for listening to my story. I wish you all the strength to cultivate your own folly and the joy of watching it bloom.